George T. Stagg, one of my favorite releases annually from the Buffalo Trace Antique Collection. We're going to talk about it here a little bit more in a minute, but 15-year barrel-proof bourbon from Buffalo Trace, generally regarded as fantastic. Then we've got Stagg Jr. Stagg Jr. is generally regarded as not George T. Stagg. We're going to talk about those two today and find out if one of the more recent release George T. Stagg Jr.'s lives up to George T. Stagg. I'm Scott Hill from Flight Club, flightclubict.com, and I'm here with the guy down here in the corner.
Hey, Steve Netherton, also with Flight Club ICT, getting ready to pit up father and son, George T. Stagg and Stagg Jr.
Let's see how they do. Tell us a little bit about, let's start with George T. Stagg and the Antique Collection release. Tell us a little bit about that one.
Yeah, just very briefly, because you can find as much information as you want out there if you just Google Buffalo Trace Antique Collection. But George T. Stagg, being one of the members of the Antique Collection from Buffalo Trace, has come out every fall since 2002. It's from Buffalo Trace's Mash Bill #1. It's their barrel-proof, robust, kind of King Daddy bourbon. It has been perennially a favorite amongst bourbon lovers, especially those who like barrel-proof stuff. It's always been at least 15 years old. It's always been barrel-proof. It's come out every fall since 2002. And it does not disappoint. As far as its proof is concerned, it's gone up into what people call the hazmat level, over 140 proof, several times in the past. This past year in 2017 actually clocked in a little bit lower. It's 129.7 proof, I think, if I remember right. You've got the bottle right there. It'll tell you. 129.7?
129.2.
129.2. Okay. Well, that's actually a little bit on the lower end for Mr. George T. And I don't know if this had anything to do with it, but it was actually easier to get this year. The Buffalo Trace released a lot more of George T. Stagg this past year in 2017 than it has in years prior, especially in more recent years prior. So that was welcome news to most, but I don't know if that resulted in a lot more people getting a bottle or not.
Now, yeah. you and I have both reviewed this bottle before. We both had it, and we had a theory that possibly the quality may have diminished this year because they released so much more. And at least from our prior experience with it, we didn't think that it necessarily had diminished in quality. It's different from year to year. We found it pretty enjoyable. So we'll talk about that maybe a little bit more when we talk about its comparison to Stagg Jr. Yeah,
definitely. Stagg Jr., real briefly, let's just get some background out of the way on that next. Stagg Jr. has not been released since 2002. It came along much later. It was actually first released in 2013. Buffalo Trace probably figured out, hey, we've got more of this stuff that we can try to sell off. And for the people that can't get a bottle of George T. Stagg, so we'll put it in a bottle that's about half as tall, a little bit squattier, still have the big buck antlers on there, stick Junior on it. We'll see what happens. Well, it's been released in the fall and spring every year since 2013. Still barrel proof, still Buffalo Trace Mash Bill #1. As far as its age, though, the only thing that Buffalo Trace will say is that it's been aged and then, quote, almost a decade. So wherever you feel like you want to round up to almost a decade, it's anyone's guess how old this stuff actually is, and it probably does vary a bit from year to year. Neither of these bottles are single barrel products either. So they're going to be a blend of several different barrels. In fact, for George T. Stagg, we know that because of the handout that comes with a case of George T. Stagg, there's a letter from Buffalo Trace that'll say what warehouses the barrels were pulled for that particular year. Because several different warehouses are listed and yet they all have the same proof, we know that it's a blend of many different barrels. Stagg Jr. will be the same way. So those barrels could be different ages, but the only thing Buffalo Trace says is almost a decade.
And we know this year the most recent release is 131.9 proof. We know that. Do you recall what batch number this is? Is this batch number 9?
This is, yes, batch number 9. There was a spring 2018 release that already came out. That would be batch 10. Buffalo Trace does not number the batches for Stagg Jr. Again, just go online and you'll be able to find people have compiled little charts that say, hey, if it's this proof, then you know it's this batch that was released in the fall or the spring of this year. So that's a helpful guide that you can find online. But otherwise, if you're looking at your bottle and you're thinking, which batch is this? There's not going to be a batch number. Just Google Stagg Jr. and then the proof of that, and you'll be able to find out when it was bottled.
Anything else we need to cover before we dive into these two?
I do think it's a little bit interesting that, while George T. Stagg, no matter where you are, and probably just about no matter who you are, is going to be very, very hard to get. Just because of limited quantity and the high demand. Stagg Jr. varies quite a bit from market to market. So here in Wichita, if you go to any 3 liquor stores in town, chances are you'll come across at least one bottle of Stagg Jr. At one of those stores. You go to some other markets though, and it's very difficult to find. As soon as it hits the shelf, someone will snatch it up. And so that's a little bit interesting, I think, that there's that variance in the demand and also the quantity from market to market. Maybe we should just count ourselves fortunate. But I think that should also segue into our personal experience with Stagg Jr. Maybe that speaks to why it can sit around here in Wichita the way it does without getting snatched up too quickly, is that it is but a shadow of George T. Stagg. I mean, you could describe it as maybe a hot mess, previous releases. And sometimes maybe you're in the mood for that, and that's okay. Throw a little bit of ice in the glass or some water to help tame it. But I don't know about you, Scott, but I'm not usually in the mood for Stagg Jr. It usually doesn't get me very excited.
I'm the same way. And in fact, I've got another bottle back there. I don't recall which proof it is. But it's probably got 75% of it left or so, and it's been sitting on the shelf for 4 or 5 years, 4 years maybe. Not a favorite of mine, nothing that I've been looking to necessarily replace, even though, like you said, they're readily available on the shelves here in town and at a pretty good price. We normally see them around the $55, maybe $60 range. We've been seeing them on sale lately, all the way down to $45. So for a barrel-proof product down to $45, it's almost 10 years old from Buffalo Trace. It's a pretty good buy, but it's not been one of our favorites.
It's true. But then came Batch 9. So Batch 9 is the one that was released in the fall 2017, same time basically, thereabouts as the George T. Stagg from 2017. And the internet, whether you're on Reddit or a Facebook bourbon group, there's been a little bit of buzz about this Stagg Jr. Batch 9 being close enough to the quality of George T. Stagg that people are recommending go out and get this one. This one is definitely worth getting if you haven't tried it or if you were not as impressed last time around. So we thought, you know what, let's put them side by side. They're very similar in proof. They're released at the same time. They got the same mash bill. Let's see who comes out on top and by how much.
Where should we start? Do you want to start with junior or senior?
Well, I think what I'll probably end up doing is going back and forth a little bit, maybe even nosing each and then tasting one and tasting the other right after, instead of going for one all the way through and then going for the other. So that may be the way I approach it, but I'm going to start by, I got Stagg Jr. right here now.
That's what I have as well.
Clearly it's coming across on the screen, but I am sporting my Scotch test dummies. Glenn Cairn here. Shout out to the Scotch gods over there.
Very nice. It has a different nose than what I've experienced from Stagg Jr. before. With some of Buffalo Trace's younger products, I get a kind of a cardboardiness to it. it seems that's a little bit lacking already in the nose on this one, which I'm happy to see.
And this one, I'm employing the keep your mouth a little bit open while you're smelling it, especially out of the Glencairn, with something that's a high proof product like this one. If you just end up singeing your nostrils right up front, you're done trying to smell anything for the rest of the night.
I definitely get some cinnamon, some brown sugar, some other baking spices on this.
This one's coming across much more in that, cinnamon sugar, brown sugar, the caramel kind of scent more than the Red Hots, the cherry Red Hot candies. That has been my most recent experience with Stagg Jr. anyway.
There's some good fruitiness here. I'd say some cherry,
strawberry, yeah.
Some strawberry as well. The strawberryness, I think, is kind of like a fruit leather strawberry, fruit roll-up kind of strawberry to me. A little bit more age to it. A little bit of even just plain leather notes to it as well.
Yeah, the kind of strawberry you get from something that's artificial strawberry, not the actual strawberry fruit. It's like a strawberry candy.
A little bit of kind of salt and pepper to it as well. I enjoy this.
Yeah, this is a much more approachable nose than I'm used to with Stagg Jr. I don't get that kind of sizzling red hot experience that, like I said, I've gotten before.
There's a little bit of maybe kind of a Fig Newton cookie, both in terms of the fruit and the cake as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting comment there, because when you combine kind of some of that baking spice with a little bit of that fruit, it does kind of put it together that way.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that interesting comment meant that I was wrong or.
Yeah. No, you're not smelling what you're saying you're smelling. I think you're right.
Let's see what Stagg Senior here smells like.
Yeah. So right away I get a lot more leather.
Yeah, absolutely. The fruitiness has changed on it too, although I really get fruit kind of up front on this one.
Yeah, I do as well. But the fruit I get here is almost a little bit more like a plum variety.
Yeah, I was fig, plum, and that's more in the nature of what I'm getting here.
Yeah, not as much as the cherry strawberry kind of smell.
I wouldn't have said that you were right. The red hot cinnamon from the Stagg Jr. is absent. But compared to this, there is some more heat in both in terms of ethanol and probably some cinnamon spice on the first.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't say there's much of the cinnamon sugar on the nose on this one. That brown sugar and caramel is still there for sure, but not as much as of the brighter, spicier kind of notes that the Stagg Jr. has. It also doesn't smell. Also, it almost smells sweet.
Yeah, you definitely tell this has some more age to it, and that's toned down that sweetness, I think so.
Yeah, this has a deeper nose to it. Everything's not quite right up front, but it's a more subtle nose that way. Yeah,
going back to Stagg Jr. and nosing it, I can't get my nose in the glass quite like I can on the George T. Stagg. There's definitely some additional burn here that's not present with the George T. Stagg.
Do you get a little bit of orange peel with the Stagg Jr. now?
Yeah, I do.
I was holding my glasses up for a second there to see if there's much of a color difference. And I do notice it a bit. The lighting I'm holding it up to is not ideal, but I can see a little difference. The Stagg being darker than Junior.
And I'm using my Flight Club Glencairn because, I try to stick with our brand.
Good for you, man.
Love the Scotch Test Dummy so.
Yeah, I'm getting back to the Stagg, kind of that grape skin.
Yeah, you're right. It's deeper. There's some similarity there to it, but Stagg Jr.'s still not living quite up to what George T. Stagg produces here. But both are very enjoyable.
Well, let's talk about these a little bit as we go then. So as far as the nose is concerned, head to head, are you finding that Stagg Jr. is at least approaching or in the ballpark of what the Stagg has to offer on the nose, or do you think it's not close?
It's not equal, but it's approaching. I would rate the George T. Stagg at least a half point above. I do enjoy the nose on the Stagg Jr. more than I think I've enjoyed the nose on any previous Stagg Jr. My problem historically with Stagg Jr. is there's always been some off-putting note there. It's always just been kind of a mixed bag, hodgepodge. Some good things thrown out, some bad things thrown out. There's as much that weighs against it as in favor. This lacks some of those bad notes that this has had before. So I rate this fairly enjoyable.
Yeah, on our rating scale, I definitely would give this, a 3 out of 5. 3 for us is satisfying. I would give this at least a 3 for the Stagg Jr. for sure. Like you said, better than other Stagg Jr. batches I've had, though I'm not a student of Stagg Jr. haven't compared a lot of the batches to one another. But I like this nose. I do.
Yeah, I'm probably a 3.5. I'd probably be leaning a little bit more towards the 3.5, but either way, I think the George T. Stagg to me hits sort of in that 4 ballpark. It's deeper, it's complex, it's got those leathers in it. If it's 15 years, it's not overly oaked for 15 years by any means.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going in on Stagg Jr. here. You get that rush of heat right up front, but again, it doesn't veer into the sizzling red hots like other batches have. It's more of a wave of, you get the caramel sweetness, kind of red pepper flakes, but still kind of that ground black pepper too. The brown sugar is definitely there. The fruit that I got has become more on like the fruit leather variety, because this is a chewy palate for me.
I definitely agree with chewy. My initial take on the caramel that came through was a little bit watery on the caramel, but it built a little bit. By the time it finishes, it really leaves that kind of chewy caramel. But overall, with the fruitiness in there and the fruit leather that you were talking about, it is chewy. It's not thin by any means.
And yet, at the very beginning, you were saying like it was almost a little bit watery, because at the very beginning, before the tidal wave of heat really started to come crashing down, it did feel like that's where I first detected that this is significantly younger than Stagg. It was at the definitely. Very, very beginning of the palette. It's certainly not like the cardboard, like you were saying, like if you get a bottle of Old Charter or something like that. But you get it really right up front there. And because that's the first thing that hits you, that's a little bit unfortunate, but, and that's really being nitpicky. Otherwise, it delivers on its proof for sure. I think the heat doesn't cloud as much of the palate as it does the finish. As far as, just shrouding the other flavors that are in there. There aren't just 1 or 2 notes that you can get, and that's all because it's so hot. But the finish to me was a little bit dulled by the heat.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I'm getting a whole lot new on the finish. And part of that may be, as you're describing, kind of it is a little bit dulling my mouth. I'm very used to barrel proof. This really shocked my palate tonight for whatever reason, and a little bit numbing, I think, on the tail end of the palate, start of the finish, and it leaves you kind of wondering what all is there. Nothing that I'm finding off-putting, but I'm not seeing a whole lot new there necessarily that I'm getting on the palate.
Yeah, this is one, and I didn't bring in a water drop or anything with me. I kind of wish I would have. That I think would benefit from either putting on ice or adding some water to tame that down. But again, while we're still comparing it to other Stagg Jr. experiences, it's not the fiery cinnamon red hots, and that's, you know, the beginning, middle, and end of the experience all the way through. There's more here, which I appreciate.
My take on this, you know, they don't tell us how old it is. This feels older than Stagg Jr. that I've had before.
Yeah. I'm going to consult. I pulled up one of those tables on past Stagg Jr. batches. So most likely the last Stagg Jr. I had would have been, well, it probably would have been in the fall of 2016 when we were at Monarch trying the 2016 release of George T. Stagg and going ahead and getting a pour of Stagg Jr. right next to it. I don't remember what batch that would have been, but let's say it was also the fall 2016 batch of Stagg Jr. The proof on that was 130, even 130. This is 131.9, but if you made me guess which of those had a higher proof, I would have said easily the 2016, and by something significant, like by 5 or more. I would have guessed that if this was 131 that we're having right now, I would have guessed that was at least 136.
I definitely agree. And that's, I think, a little bit impacting my gut reaction on scoring, et cetera, is, you know, I've had these previous batches before. To me, this one stands well above some of those previous batches that I've had of Stagg Jr. You know, you're talking 3, you're talking 3.5 on our scale. Some of those other ones have ranked pretty low. This one definitely beats them out, and that lack of burning and the additional complexity with age really helps make this one stand apart.
Yeah. I'm gonna take a palate cleanser break here before I get into the George T.
Yeah, we'll come back to some scores on this one after we've had a little bit more time with the George T. Stagg. That's phenomenal. I don't know where you're going to write that down, but you know, the burn is not there at all, even that you experience with the Stagg Jr. It's just delicious. I get a lot of cherry, some cinnamon, brown sugar, caramel, just delicious leather flavors throughout, both in the palate and the finish on this.
Yeah, this has a level of heat to it that does not overpower anything, and its peak is not as high as the Stagg Jr.'s was, but it delivers an extra at least 1 or 2 levels of flavor that Stagg Jr. didn't have, to where it descends into that leather. Yeah, if you had to just nutshell of this palette, you would say it's like the cherry fruit leather dipped in some cinnamon sugar. It's really quite nice.
The tail end of the palette, start of the finish on this. Let me back up. My prior experience with some of the older Buffalo Trace Antique Collection, like the Eagle Rare 17, it had a lot of like dark chocolate kind of flavors on it, almost drying. This starts to approach that, but ends kind of in a nice place. It lets you know that there's a little bit of dryness right there at that tail end, a little bit of that kind of cocoa dark chocolate, but it doesn't leave your mouth completely dry, and that the sweetness of those caramel sugars kind of stick in there, but it just adds a whole lot more complexity and layers to the end palate and start to finish.
Yeah, and I remember being concerned the first time I had this and thinking that it was really going to start to veer off and becoming really tannic on the finish. It doesn't, but it's there enough where you have that concern, I guess I should say. And so if you did have to nitpick this one, that would be probably the one thing you would point out. But otherwise, it's really, really nice and a little bit more approachable, I think, than previous releases of Stagg.
Long on the finish, I don't know quite describes this one. This one's going to stick around in your mouth for a while, and it's not just burn. There's a lot of flavors that sit there, lingering kind of cherry fruit flavors for me. There's a little bit of that strawberry, maybe kind of that fruit leather strawberry that just sit there in your mouth and really invite you back for a next streak.
Yeah, it does linger quite a bit, and I'm left with, if you were to sprinkle some red pepper flakes or even like a drop or two of Tabasco onto like an apple crisp, like a really heavy dose of cinnamon inside that apple crisp. But they're those little bits of heat that almost it's not really salty, but there's something there too that's just giving this another dimension that makes it really interesting.
Yeah, Tabasco is a good call on some of the flavor that you're getting out of this, that kind of rich pepper heat. It's not just quite what you're used to. It's not just pure alcohol burn. It's not just that red hot cinnamon candy. There's a little bit more depth to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit unfair to put the Stagg name on something else and then demand just inherently a comparison to something this good. But wow, George T. Stagg, it's truly wonderful.
My favorite part, I think, of the whole George T. Stagg experience is probably the finish. We talk about kind of chewy palate. That one to me is a very, very chewy finish. Like I talked about, it lingers for a very long time, but I'm kind of left doing that weird mouth kind of chew thing when you're just sitting there. You don't have anything in your mouth, but you feel like you really still do. Very enjoyable experience there in the finish.
Yeah, if this was a horse race between these two, right out of the gate, it seems like Stagg Jr. is really keeping up stride for stride with Stagg, enough so that you really think it's going to be a close call at the end. Stagg really in the maybe around the first or second corner starts to put some distance between Stagg Jr., but by the time they hit the home stretch on that finish, that's where Stagg really shows that it's got so much more to offer than Stagg Jr. does, and ends up winning by a wide margin. But you always knew this was not a race that Stagg Jr. was gonna win. You were just hoping it would compete and make a good showing, right? I mean, that's why you go and you buy it, at least around here.
Yeah, absolutely. I know there's a lot of people who love the Stagg Jr. as sort of a standalone product. We'll get in a minute to our opinions on whether it is a good and fair substitute. But maybe let's talk about some just scoring. We've given the nose some scores. Are you ready to give some scores to the palate and the finish on these two?
Yeah, I think so. I think while I'd agree with your 3.5 on the nose for Stagg Jr., I would certainly not put it above 3.5 on the palate. I mean, I'm actually wondering if it is deserving a little bit more of a 3. But I have to remind myself it's because I'm drinking it next to Stagg, which is one of my favorite, not just bourbons, but whiskeys overall for 2017. So I think I should more fairly score the palate on Stagg Jr. at 3.5.
I think that's right where I am at too. Not my favorite, like the George T. Stagg, and maybe that's a little bit foreshadowing of how I would score the George T. Stagg, but it's very good. And it's a little bit hard for me to say because I've not been a fan of Stagg Jr. before.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not quite ready to give it a 4 on the palate because I don't like it more than the nose, for one. But I don't think it just quite gets to that level of 4 being the really more than satisfied. It's just not quite there.
No, I agree.
On the finish, though, I feel like that the finish on this Stagg Jr., I think it might be its weakest point. Just because, like you said earlier, I think that's right, that you don't get anything more than you get on the palate on the finish. And by the time you get to the finish, it seems like on Stagg Jr., you're a little bit numbed by that stinging from the heat, because the heat really ramps up quite a bit. So I think I might, on the finish, drop it back down to a 3. I don't think it gets below that for me. But I do think I'll drop it back down to a 3 on the finish.
I agree. I went back to it. As I mentioned the first time I went through it, I had a little bit of a palate shock from the alcohol. I've gone back to it a couple times now. At the very start of the finish, there's some, what I get is some like additional leather notes that look like they're really going to pop and be kind of a wow flavor, but they're just there for a split second and they go right away, and that burn takes back over. If that had stayed around, I think this would be sort of that 3.5. Who knows, maybe even 4 kind of ballpark. But right now, where it's at with the amount of burn that's there, there's nothing a whole lot new to it. I think 3 is spot on.
What I'm also realizing with Stagg Jr. too is that it's probably a pour that is going to do better if it's not the leadoff hitter for the evening. It's better following up something with lower proof, which would not be hard to do. But you almost need like a warm up before you go into Stagg Jr. I think what you were saying about it kind of shocking your palate, I think it would benefit from that.
Yeah, this tastes like a higher proof version of standard Buffalo Trace. I do get a little bit more age. I think Buffalo Trace tends to be more that probably 6-7 year ballpark. I don't know if this is 10. My guess is maybe not. It's not been quite 10. Maybe this is a little bit older than what it's been. But this seems to follow kind of a Buffalo Trace profile. So I think you're right. If I were to start something off and have something to drink first, I might even stick with a standard Buffalo Trace and then lead up to this. And I think that would be a very enjoyable experience.
Yeah, it's probably a really good suggestion. The George T. Stagg on the palate and finish, I think the finish on the George T is its strongest attribute. And so while I would have given it a 4 on the nose, which I think it's actually its weakest attribute, and that just shows you how good it is. I think on the George T on the palate, I'm not sure if it warrants quite a 4.5. Maybe it does. I think I'd probably do a 4.5 on the palate on the George T. Stagg and a 5 on the finish. I'm not sure what else I want on a finish that I don't get out of the George T.
Yeah, I'm not sure what more you could ask for on a finish. Oh, I just had another pour of it, and again, I'm doing that. I'm trying not to talk. I'm still trying to chew the finish. I would be right there with you. The palate to me teeters between that 4 and 4.5. The finish teeters between that 4.5 and 5. It's delicious.
Yeah, and that's not to say that a 5 out of 5 for us doesn't mean that it's the best there ever is and there ever will be. Many different things can get a 5 out of 5. It's just for that particular experience. Is it really hitting all the notes that you want? Is it knocking down all those pins? And it does. And more than one different kind of whiskey or whatever can do that for you. But I think for this particular one, to try to find a flaw that would knock that score down below a 5 for me on the finish, I'm not sophisticated enough to find it.
Let's stick with the George T. Stagg, since that's the one we're hot on right now. Give us an overall score. What's your overall assessment on this? And keep in mind, this isn't a price-sensitive overall score. What's the experience for you, just in general enjoyment?
Yeah, for overall for me, I think this is a 4.5. The reason it's not a 5 is because it doesn't have that that factor that makes it so unique and stand out from everything else in a way where you're going to remember like a particular attribute about it. The thing about this George T. Stagg is is actually remarkably balanced. One, for how old it is, and two, for how high a proof it is. And really, three, if you want to throw in this too, the fact that Buffalo Trace Mash Bill #1 is so darn corn heavy, the fact that this doesn't blow our minds with how sweet it is incredible. And so I think when you put all those together, this is just about as balanced and refined as a 15-year-old barrel-proof bourbon product could be. But what could have bumped it up from a 4.5 to 5 is if it had that little something really unique, or something kind of off the wall extra, and that's going to vary from person to person. But that's where I would put as a 4.5.
I would go 4.5 too, and that really surprises me from my personal experience and take of giving something a bourbon that is 15 years old that high of score. I'm not someone who's a big fan of oak on my bourbons. Normally, when you get above 12 years, that oak level hits so hard. You get so much tannins, dryness, oak wood flavors to it that it overshadows everything out. I would absolutely not say that about George T. Stagg. Does it drink with a sophistication and refinement and complexity of a 15-year? Absolutely. But there is just none of that really heavy oak flavors from what I would typically associate with a 15-plus-year-old bourbon. I think it's absolutely delicious. I totally support a 4.5 on this.
What would you give overall on Stagg Jr.?
I think it's a 3.5. I'm surprised on how good it is. Being a point lower than George T. Stagg is probably about right. Our scoring for overall score isn't mathematical. It's 3.5. I mean, it approaches 4 for me. But again, that may be more of trying to compare it to previous batches. I really enjoy it. It's an easy 3.5 for me.
Yeah, I'd agree with the 3.5. It does offer up a little bit something higher on the enjoyability scale than just a standard 3 would for me. And I appreciate something that's barrel proof, and it says I think we can probably count on it's younger than 10 years. And so rather than being disjointed in the hot mess that you come in maybe expecting if you've had Stagg Jr. before, this doesn't do that. And so that's a welcome change.
All right, this bottle I paid $45 for here in town. What do you give this on a value score?
Yeah, on a value for that, gosh, I think I'd stick with 3.5 actually. And the reason I don't quite go to 4 is that's not that far off of what you can get for Elijah Craig barrel proof, which is age stated at 12 years, and something it's hard to find one that you don't like very much. I mean, you're going to like just about every release of Elijah Craig barrel proof you can find. So it doesn't quite reach that level for me, but I would stick with 3.5.
I'd probably argue for a 4. I'd be fine with a 3.5. You talk about Elijah Craig barrel proof. You find that around here in that $50 to $60 range. I've seen it in neighboring states for as low as $45. That's one of those that starts to define a close to a 5 on value for me. It's Elijah Craig barrel proof is just so delicious at that price point. It's really hard to make a comparison here. I still think at $45 or even $50, this is a darn good buy compared to a standard bottle of Buffalo Trace at maybe $25. The level of enjoyment here is so much more than that. I'd probably go towards a 4, but then I'd probably put the Elijah Craig barrel proof that you're talking about closer to that 5 range.
And really, too, when you consider all the store picks of the Knob Creek single barrel bourbon, which are bottled at 120 proof, and while that's not barrel proof, it's actually really close for a lot of them. And you're seeing a lot of those for $45. I mean, there's competition at that price point.
Yeah. George T. Stagg. What do you want to call it for price? Retail around here, when you can find retail, tends to be around $100. I think, to the extent that our club is able to get any of the Buffalo Trace antique collection from year to year, we're paying anywhere from, I don't know that I want to say this on video, $79 all the way to maybe $200. I think is probably the limit for what most of us are willing to pay. I'd say probably 99 on this one for me, maybe a fair price assessment for what we collectively paid for our bottles in our group. What do you think?
Yeah, I think if you're going to score this at the value of the retail of $79.99, it's a 5, and we can just move on. But if you start thinking about what's more realistic, I think at 99, you're at a 4, maybe 4.5 for value. I think it's not uncommon for this to be listed at more like 120. And then I would still stick with 4.5. When you get up to 199, I don't know. That's where it starts to get pretty tough, because it's going to vary so much from person to person with where you're at right then when you're thinking about throwing down 200 bones for any kind of whiskey. I mean, you got to really like it, and so value at that point might kind of just go out the window. So I don't know. We're working on kind of a sliding scale here, but once you get up to $200, that's where I'm starting to think it's maybe 3.5, 4 at the most.
I'm right there with you on your sliding scale. It's really tough to rate these bottles that don't have a traditional retail price, at least in most places around here. It's just so tough to get them, and you're faced with, spending $199 on that store who wants to take a markup. No comment on that right now. And then you start looking at what secondary values are on these bottles, where you're looking at $300, $400, $500 on. You're probably looking around $400 on this one, or around that ballpark. It's really tough to give a value at those kinds of levels, but I'm right there with you on your sliding scale. Let's maybe the more appropriate question might be, assuming you can't get your hands on the George T. Stagg, and you see a bottle of Stagg Jr. sitting on the shelf for $45, is it a fair substitute? What do you think?
No, it's not a fair substitute. That doesn't mean you shouldn't get it. I think it's unfair to Stagg Jr. that's what it's called. I think if Buffalo Trace called this something else entirely, that might actually be a little bit better for it, because it's not a fair substitute for George T. Stagg. It's kind of like JFK and JFK Jr. That wasn't fair to that kid, man. That wasn't going to work out, him living up to that name. So I don't know. I don't think that it's wise to view it as a substitute, like you're getting almost the same thing, because you're not. But could you still get something that you enjoy and that's pretty darn good? Well, yeah, I think you might.
Yeah, and I think that's fair, and I think that's a fair response to part of that question that kind of we led with, or that analysis that we led with, that people said that this year's, or the 2017 Stagg Jr. approached the level of George T. Stagg. I'm with you that I don't think it really does approach, but doesn't mean it can't be an enjoyable whiskey, following along with many of the other Buffalo Trace products that are available.
See, here's where I think it would be a better fit as far as perspective is. You can go out and get Buffalo Trace, and that it's going to be somewhere between, at this point now, 4 to 7 years old, somewhere in there. But it's their standard bearer mash bill #1 product. See if you like it. If you do, then go get Eagle Rare, and you'll know that it's 10 years old. It's the same proof as Buffalo Trace. And if you're thinking, man, I still really like this stuff, I wonder what this exact same mash bill by this exact same distiller tastes like at barrel proof. Well, you're probably not going to be able to have that experience with George T. Stagg. But if you're still curious what it tastes like at barrel proof, go and get Stagg Jr. and think of it in that line. find out how interesting it is to taste a product at those different age levels between Buffalo Trace and Eagle Rare, and then take the jump to barrel proof and just see how it changes the complexion of everything. And I think view it in that manner, and that can be an enjoyable experience.
Yeah, throw the little curveball in there, and we've done this analysis on our site on some of our reviews, but the Colonel E.H. Taylor curveball in there that isn't an age-stated product either, or at least most of it's not. The barrel proof is very difficult to obtain here locally, but as you're talking about, it's a Buffalo Trace mash bill number 1. It falls in that same line that you're talking about. For me, I'm probably leaning more towards the Colonel E.H. Taylor for a higher proof Buffalo Trace product than George Stagg Jr. But you're right. I think if you find yourself a fan of Buffalo Trace products, there's many other Buffalo Trace products out there that are a little bit different in some way, whether it's a higher proof, a cast strength, or maybe a little bit older like an Eagle Rare. There's something out there for you.
Yeah, and on our review on our site, if you're curious to see what we thought about George T. Stagg versus the E.H. Taylor barrel proof, we did them side by side for the 2017 Stagg. But yeah, I think being able to do those kinds of comparisons is fun. Throw out is this rare, is this special, or is this close to being special? I'll put it this way: it's just as close as Old Weller Antique is to William LaRue Weller. How about that?
There you go. There you go. All right. Any other kind of closing parting thoughts on this one?
I know. Can you think of a senior and junior combination that you think most closely resembles these two bourbons?
You throw these questions out at me, and you've got a correct answer in your head. So you're looking to stump me, and then you're going to go ahead and give us the right answers. Let's bypass that. Let's go ahead and give us the right answer.
That's a deft strategy. Well, I threw out JFK, and that was fraught with turmoil, and those two met their demise tragically. So maybe that's not a fair comparison for anything. And not that one of these individuals didn't meet a similar tragic ending, but maybe Dale Earnhardt and Dale Earnhardt Jr. Now, I'm not a NASCAR fan by any stretch of the imagination, but I do know enough about the internet to find out about these two people, because I was looking to see who would be closest. And I think Dale Earnhardt, it seems like with NASCAR fans, holds a level of esteem that maybe no driver will ever attain, at least for this generation. So Dale Earnhardt Jr. takes the same number, has been successful in his own right, but will never, really no matter what he does, be his dad and meet that same level. And so that's what I think is the most apt comparison. George T. Stagg Jr., it's unfair that you have to bear the same name. Thank you for doing your best. But no one should think that you will stand on that same platform as your daddy.
Great parting thought. Again, we must not have anything substantive left to talk about. So we'll sign off. Again, thank you. And find our full review at flightclubict.com, and we'll put a link here in the YouTube video.
All right. See you later.